The port was alive with activity. Alina stood at the edge of the bustling dock, staring up at the Ocean Queen. The massive cruise ship loomed over her, a monument to luxury and escape, gleaming under the midday sun. A sigh of relief escaped her lips as she hoisted her small suitcase over her shoulder and made her way toward the gangway. She needed this. After months of endless litigation and grueling work as a corporate lawyer, the week-long cruise was a sanctuary. A gift to herself. It had been far too long since she had allowed herself any peace, let alone the time to reflect. Her mind was always occupied, fleeing from one case to the next, one argument to the next. Now, all she wanted was silence. Peace. The vast ocean would be her companion, and for a moment, she believed it could help her forget. Forget the mistakes of the past, the haunting memories of that night, the accident that had claimed her friend. That night still lingered, pressing on her chest when she tried to sleep. As she checked in at the front desk and received her room key, Alina felt a momentary surge of excitement. Her cabin, 432, was small but elegant, a quiet retreat tucked away from the rest of the ship's hustle. The window faced the endless expanse of ocean, stretching out to the horizon. She stood by it for a while, watching the water churn and stretch, an infinite black-blue abyss. It was calming, but also lonely. She had chosen isolation on purpose, but now, as she gazed into the vast nothingness, it felt oppressive. Alina shook her head, closing the curtains as if that would block out the strange sense of emptiness. She would rest now. Tomorrow, the ocean would be a comfort. The gentle rocking of the ship lulled Alina into a heavy sleep. The ship's movements felt soothing, as if cradling her to sleep. The long day of preparation, travel, and the emotional exhaustion of finally stepping away from her life had taken its toll. For the first time in months, she drifted into sleep without the weight of her responsibilities pressing on her. But the peace didn't last. At first, it was subtle, so faint that Alina thought she was still dreaming. A soft knock at her door. She stirred, groggy and disoriented, but the knock came again, slightly louder this time. She blinked into the darkness, her heart thudding in her chest, unsure if it had really happened. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the ship's engines. Another knock, just a whisper against the wood. Alina's body tensed. She climbed out of bed, padding quietly to the door. Her breath caught in her throat as she peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, dimly lit, and eerily quiet. She hesitated, hand on the doorknob, before deciding it wasn't worth investigating. Perhaps it had been a mistake. Someone knocking on the wrong door. Or, maybe she had imagined it. After all, she was exhausted. Yes, that was it, just exhaustion. Still, as she returned to bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, a faint unease settled over her. Sleep didn't come as easily this time. The next day, Alina tried to forget the strange knocking. She spent the afternoon wandering the ship, observing the other passengers lounging by the pool or gathered in the various lounges and restaurants. The sun was bright, the ocean calm, but something still felt off. Though she was surrounded by people, Alina couldn't shake the sense of detachment. She wasn't part of their carefree world. That night, she returned to her cabin early, telling herself it was just the lingering stress of her everyday life. The cruise was meant to be an escape, but her mind was still tangled in the anxiety she carried. The events of the previous night were easily dismissed as the product of exhaustion, nothing more. But as the clock neared 3 a.m., she woke again. This time, the knock was louder, sharper. The kind of knock that demanded attention. Her heart pounded as she sat up in bed, the blankets clutched around her. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as she strained to listen. Was it her imagination again? The knock came a third time. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, Alina stood and made her way to the door, her steps tentative, cautious. She opened the peephole again, nothing. The hallway was empty, but when she turned back toward her bed, her body froze. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, stood a tall, shadowy figure. Featureless, but unmistakably human. Alina's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure simply watched her, motionless, as though waiting for something. The room seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick and cold. For what felt like an eternity, Alina remained frozen, her eyes locked on the shadow. But when she blinked, it was gone. She gasped, stumbling backward, her pulse racing. Had it been a dream? A trick of the light? Her rational mind tried to piece together an explanation, but nothing made sense. The fear clung to her like a second skin, and sleep didn't come again that night. The morning sun seemed to mock her, casting warm, golden light across her cabin as if nothing had happened. But Alina's nerves were frayed. She could still feel the figure's presence, even though it was long gone. Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over. Determined not to let the fear consume her, she made her way to the ship's lobby, where the security team operated. She tried to keep her voice steady as she explained what had happened about the knocking, the shadowy figure. The security officers listened politely, but Alina could see the skepticism in their eyes. One of them, a tall man with a calm demeanor, nodded sympathetically. "It's not uncommon for passengers to feel disoriented on long cruises," he said, his voice placating. "Stress and exhaustion can play tricks on the mind, especially out here in the middle of the ocean." Alina clenched her fists. "I know what I saw," she insisted, but the embarrassment was creeping in. They didn't believe her. The officers agreed to do a sweep of her cabin. They checked every corner, every closet, but found nothing unusual. No sign of forced entry. No trace of anyone having been there at all. "Just try to relax," the officer said kindly. "You're safe here." But Alina didn't feel safe. Not anymore. That night, Alina tried to immerse herself in distraction. She spent hours in the ship's library, her eyes skimming over pages of books she couldn't focus on. Her mind was too clouded with the events of the previous nights, the feeling of being watched, the weight of isolation pressing down on her. By the time she returned to her cabin, her nerves were frayed beyond repair. The clock ticked closer to 3 a.m., and Alina found herself dreading the hour, her anxiety building with each passing minute. Then, right on schedule, the knock. But this time, she was ready. Fueled by fear and frustration, Alina bolted out of bed and rushed to the door, yanking it open. Her eyes darted down the hallway, searching for any sign of life. Nothing. Again. Her heart raced as she turned back toward the room, and that's when she saw him. The figure was back, standing closer than before, his hollow eyes darker, more defined. He didn't move, but his presence felt suffocating, consuming the room in a wave of cold terror. Paralyzed with fear, Alina could only watch as he slowly began to step toward her, each movement deliberate, each step closer. In a blind panic, she reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to dial for help, but the screen was dead. The figure vanished just as quickly as he had appeared, leaving her breathless and trembling. For the first time, Alina truly questioned whether she was losing her mind or if something far worse was happening. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and Alina's breath came in ragged gasps. She stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the now empty corner where the shadowy figure had been moments before. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. The figure, was it real? It felt too vivid to be a dream, yet too terrifying to be reality. Without another thought, she bolted for the door, yanking it open and rushing into the dimly lit hallway. The silence of the ship at this hour only heightened her fear. Her footsteps echoed as she fled, her body moving on instinct. Her destination was the lobby, where she hoped to find safety, or at least answers. The few crew members she passed looked at her with confusion, but Alina didn't stop to explain. She burst into the lobby, gasping for air, her body trembling with adrenaline and fear. "I need security," she managed to stammer. "Now. Please." Within minutes, the head of security arrived, a tall man with a calm demeanor, his expression concerned yet skeptical. Alina hurriedly explained the encounter, her words tumbling out in rapid succession, the knocks, the figure, the cold, consuming terror. But as she spoke, she could see the doubt forming in his eyes. "Miss," he said carefully, "I understand this is upsetting, but it's possible you're just overworked. These things happen, especially at sea. Exhaustion, stress, they can play tricks on the mind." "No." Alina shot back, her voice rising. "I'm not imagining this. I know what I saw. The head of security offered to search her cabin again, and though every muscle in her body resisted the idea of returning there, Alina followed. The search was thorough, but unsurprisingly, nothing was found. The shadowy figure was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. "You should get some rest," the security officer said gently, "and we can offer you another cabin if this one is unsettling." Alina shook her head, refusing to let fear control her. Switching rooms felt like giving in, admitting defeat. She couldn't let herself be seen as fragile, especially not now, when her reality felt like it was crumbling. "No," she whispered, "I'll stay." The next morning, sunlight streamed into the ship's lounge, casting long, golden beams across the polished floors. Alina sat by the wide windows, a cup of coffee cooling between her hands. She hadn't slept much. The night had been long, restless, her mind racing with images of the shadow, her body tense with the memory of cold eyes watching her. She stared out at the ocean, hoping the sight of the vast, endless blue would calm her. The waves were steady, rhythmic, but something about them seemed off. As if they weren't just waves, but something alive, something watching her in return. Alina closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, trying to quiet her thoughts. And then she heard it. Alina. Her name. Soft, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind. Her eyes snapped open, her heart lurching. She looked around, but the lounge was nearly empty, and no one was near her. Panic surged through her. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she checked for any messages, any explanation. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the screen. "You can't run from the sea." Alina blinked, staring at the words in disbelief. But when she scrolled, the message vanished, as if it had never been there. Her stomach churned with unease. Was she hallucinating? Was this real? The once calming presence of the sea now felt sinister, as if it were closing in on her from all sides. Paranoia gnawed at her. She wanted to believe it was just her mind playing tricks, but every part of her screamed that something much darker was happening. Determined to make sense of the growing madness, Alina sought refuge in the ship's small library later that afternoon. The quiet, shadowy room was filled with old, weathered books, many of which hadn't been touched in years. The air smelled of paper and dust, and the dim light created a sense of timelessness. Alina rifled through the shelves, searching for anything that might give her clues about the ship's history, its passengers, something that could explain what was happening to her. After hours of fruitless searching, her fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound logbook. It was old, its cover cracked with age. She opened it cautiously, the brittle pages filled with notes and stories of strange occurrences that had plagued the ship for years. She skimmed the entries, her heart pounding as she read account after account of passengers hearing whispers, seeing shadows, experiences not unlike her own. Her eyes settled on one name that appeared more than once, Hendrik van Holt. Hendrik had been a reclusive passenger many years ago. According to the log, he had boarded the ship in a state of emotional turmoil. The entries hinted at his growing obsession with the ocean, his belief that it was speaking to him. He had disappeared mysteriously during the voyage, his body never found. Alina's skin prickled. She wasn't the first person to encounter the shadowy figure. The more she read about Hendrik, the more she realized that he, too, had been marked, claimed, by the sea. Her fear turned into grim determination. Hendrik was connected to what was happening to her, and she needed to know why. By evening, the sun had begun to set, casting a fiery orange glow across the ocean. Alina stepped out onto the upper deck, her hair whipping in the wind. The air was cooler now, and the waves seemed darker, more ominous, as they rolled endlessly into the horizon. She stood by the railing, staring out at the vastness before her. The ship felt distant, as if she were alone in the middle of the sea. And then she heard it again. A low hum, deep and resonant, rising from the depths of the water. The sound filled her ears, vibrating through her bones. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the ship. It was the sea. And it was calling her. "It's time to come home." The voice was distorted, echoing in her mind, pulling her closer to the edge. Alina's body moved of its own accord, her feet shuffling toward the railing. She gripped it tightly, feeling the cold metal under her hands. The ocean stretched out before her, infinite, endless, beckoning. The pull was undeniable. For a moment, she felt a strange sense of peace, as if letting go, surrendering to the sea, would free her from the fear, the whispers, the haunting presence of Hendrik. She leaned forward, her breath catching as her weight shifted. But then, like a splash of cold water, reality slammed back into her. She gasped, stepping back from the railing, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She couldn't do it. She couldn't let the ocean take her. Not yet. That night, Alina returned to her cabin, her mind still buzzing with the pull of the sea. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but the fear of what awaited her in sleep kept her on edge. She tried to stay awake, her eyes heavy as she paced the small room, but the weight of exhaustion eventually overtook her. In her dream, she was underwater. The deep, crushing cold enveloped her, dragging her down into the black abyss. She struggled to swim to the surface, her lungs burning for air, but a powerful force pulled her deeper. Above her, Hendrik floated, watching silently, his hollow eyes fixed on her. "You can't escape," his voice whispered, echoing in the darkness. "You belong to the ocean now." Alina woke with a start, gasping for breath, her body drenched in sweat. She looked around the cabin, her eyes darting to every corner, and there, at the foot of her bed, stood the figure again, closer than ever. Hendrik's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, his presence suffocating. He didn't move, but his voice, barely audible, whispered, "Soon." Alina's heart raced. She was marked, claimed by the same force that had taken Hendrik. And now, she understood that her fate was sealed. Alina jolted awake, gasping for breath, her body drenched in sweat. Every muscle in her body ached, as if she had been swimming against a strong current all night. She sat up, her mind still reeling from the dream, if it had even been a dream. Hendrik's hollow eyes, watching her as she sank deeper into the cold, dark abyss of the ocean, his voice echoing in her mind, "You belong to the sea." She stumbled out of bed, her limbs heavy and stiff, and made her way to the bathroom. Splashing cold water on her face, she hoped to wash away the remnants of the night, but the moment she lifted her head to look in the mirror, her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection was distorted, blurry, as though she were staring through a thick layer of fog. She blinked rapidly, hoping her vision would clear, but the image remained faint, distant. Her heart pounded. She leaned closer to the mirror, panic rising, but then, just as suddenly as it had happened, her reflection snapped back into focus. But something was wrong. Her eyes seemed sunken, her skin pale, almost translucent. She recoiled, shaking her head, trying to convince herself that it was nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. This was all just stress, she told herself. She hadn't slept properly in days, and now her mind was turning against her. But deep down, Alina knew something was very, very wrong. The restaurant buzzed with the soft murmur of morning conversations as Alina sat alone at a small table by the window. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly, waves gently lapping against the ship's hull. But today, the ocean didn't seem peaceful. It felt like a prison, cold, vast, and suffocating. Alina tried to focus on her breakfast, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She glanced around the room, watching the other passengers, but something felt off. No one looked at her. It was as if she didn't exist. The waitstaff passed by her table without stopping, never once meeting her eyes. She raised a hand to wave over a server, but they glided right past her as if she weren't even there. Her frustration grew. She stood up and approached a couple at a nearby table, waving her hand in front of their faces. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaky. "Can you see me?" The woman glanced around, completely unaware of Alina's presence. The man didn't even flinch. Alina's heart sank, a cold realization washing over her. She was invisible to them, trapped in a world that was slightly out of sync with theirs. She wasn't just emotionally isolated anymore, she was physically disappearing, fading from the world around her. She stumbled back to her table, her pulse racing. The feeling of panic swelled in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. She needed to escape, but from what? The ship? The ocean? Herself? The weight of it all was becoming unbearable. Alina fled from the restaurant, her footsteps quick and unsteady as she roamed the ship's hallways, desperate for any sign that she was still part of the real world. The ship, which had once been a place of refuge, now felt like a labyrinth, its long corridors stretching out before her in an endless, dizzying maze. Every turn led to another hallway, every door led to emptiness. The lights flickered as she passed, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Each flicker seemed to make the shadows grow longer, darker. She could feel the ship closing in on her, the weight of the ocean pressing down from all sides. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, barely audible, like a faint breeze rustling through the cracks of the ship. But as she walked, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They echoed from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "Alina," they called. "Join us, you belong here." She stopped in her tracks, her body trembling. The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, from the very structure of the ship. She pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block them out, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. Alina turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the hallway as the voices followed her, surrounding her, closing in on her. The ship was alive, watching her, calling her, trapping her. She was losing her grip on reality. She could feel it slipping away, her mind unraveling piece by piece. Desperate for answers, Alina descended into the lower levels of the ship, where the crew worked in the engine rooms and supply areas. It was quieter down here, far away from the passengers, and she hoped she could find anyone who might have answers. Lars, an older deckhand she had seen around the ship, was hunched over a crate in a small storage room when she found him. His weathered face showed the wear of years at sea, and his eyes held a guarded knowledge. Alina had heard rumors that Lars knew more about the ship's strange history than anyone else on board. She cornered him, her voice trembling as she asked about cabin 432 and the name Hendrik van Holt. At first, Lars was reluctant, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, but as Alina pressed him, the truth began to spill out. Hendrik was a writer, Lars said, his voice low and gravelly. He boarded this ship a long time ago, looking for inspiration. But something happened to him. He became obsessed with the ocean, claimed it was calling to him. He disappeared one night during a storm. They never found his body, but people started seeing him after that. Alina's heart raced. Seeing him how? As a shadow, Lars replied, his eyes darkening. A figure that appears to those marked by the sea. Marked? Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lars nodded gravely. Those who die unresolved, who carry their guilt to their grave, they're marked by the ocean. And those marked never leave the ship. Alina's stomach turned. She realized, with growing horror, that she wasn't just being haunted by Hendrik. She was next. Alina returned to her cabin in a daze, her mind reeling from Lars's words. She had to fight back, she told herself. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. But as she entered the cabin and caught sight of herself in the mirror, a cold wave of terror crashed over her. Her reflection was barely there. Her eyes were sunken, her skin ashen, almost translucent. Worse still, her form flickered like an image on an old television set, struggling to stay in focus. She touched her face, but her hand passed through the mirror as though it wasn't solid. Panic set in. Alina grabbed her phone, frantically trying to call for help, but the screen was dead, cracked and lifeless. She felt trapped, the walls of the cabin closing in on her. The air grew thick with the familiar whispers, swirling around her, suffocating her. It's time, Alina. She spun around, and there, at the foot of her bed, stood Hendrik. His figure was sharper now, more defined. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his presence filled the room with a cold, suffocating dread. Alina tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat constricted, her body paralyzed with fear. Hendrik took a step closer, his voice low and commanding. It's time. Alina's body began to fade, her limbs flickering in and out of existence. She reached for the door, but her hand passed through the handle, her fingers no longer solid. She was becoming one with the ship. And in that final, desperate moment, the truth hit her like a tidal wave. She had never boarded the ship. She had died in the car accident, and this voyage had been a passage into the afterlife. The ship, the ocean, Hendrik, they had been guiding her toward the inevitable truth. She was dead. And now, she was part of the ship. Forever. Alina stood before the mirror, watching her reflection flicker like a candle about to extinguish. The edges of her figure blurred, and the once sharp angles of her face now appeared hollow and ethereal. Her skin, once full of life, seemed drained of color, as though the very vitality of her being had been siphoned away. She reached out to touch her cheek, but her hand passed through her own reflection like smoke dissipating in the air. The whispers surrounded her, growing louder, filling the space with a constant hum. She could hear them in the walls, the ceiling, even in the floor beneath her feet. The ship itself seemed to breathe with her, each whisper syncing with the rhythm of her pulse. And then, Hendrik's voice rose above the others, cold and calm. "This was always your destination." The weight of those words crashed over her like a wave. This ship, this nightmare, it wasn't a trap or a coincidence. It was inevitable. Her final stop on a journey that had begun long before she ever boarded the Ocean Queen. Her guilt, her unresolved pain, had sealed her fate long ago. The ocean had claimed her the moment she had crashed her car, the moment she had lost everything that made her human. Exhausted, Alina collapsed onto the bed. Not from any physical exertion, but from the crushing realization that she had been fighting against the inevitable. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling her identity, the confident lawyer, the driven woman, slip away like sand through her fingers. It all felt so distant now, like a memory she could no longer touch. The ship rocked gently, its steady rhythm almost lulling her into a trance. But there would be no peace here. Not for her. She was no longer a passenger on this ship. She was becoming part of it. Lying on the bed, Alina felt her mind drift. Memories swirled around her, pulling her back to the moment that had sealed her fate. The dim cabin faded, replaced by the familiar scene of that stormy night, the rain hammering against her windshield, the wipers struggling to clear the water fast enough. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles white with tension. She could see herself now, driving recklessly through the night. Guilt over her friend's death gnawed at her, her mind clouded with regret. She wasn't paying attention, wasn't focused on the road ahead. And then, in the blink of an eye, the car in front of her swerved, its headlights cutting through the rain like two sharp blades. She jerked the wheel, trying to avoid a collision, but the tires lost traction. The world spun. The car crashed into the guardrail, and then, nothing. Alina felt it all again. The coldness that followed. The sensation of floating, as though she were suspended in time. For a brief moment, there had been peace. Then, darkness. She woke with a start, back in her cabin, the memory of the crash still fresh in her mind. Her hand instinctively moved to her chest, but there was no heartbeat. No familiar thump of life pulsing through her. Her breath caught in her throat as the truth settled deep within her. She wasn't alive. Not anymore. Her body was lying somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, and her soul was tethered to this ship, unable to move on. Later that night, unable to stay in the cabin any longer, Alina wandered out onto the ship's bow. The wind whipped against her, sharp and cold, but she barely felt it. The ocean stretched out before her, dark and endless, the horizon barely distinguishable from the night sky. And there, at the edge of the deck, stood Hendrik. He was waiting for her. His back was turned, his gaze fixed on the sea. His form was more solid now, no longer the shadowy figure that had haunted her nights. His eyes, faintly glowing in the moonlight, reflected the depth of the ocean behind him. He didn't turn as she approached, but his voice drifted toward her, soft and haunting. "I tried to fight it too, you know." Alina stopped a few feet away, her heart heavy with dread. "I thought I could escape," Hendrik continued, his voice carrying on the wind. "But the ocean calls to those of us who aren't ready to leave. It claims us. I was a fool to think I could run from it." His words resonated deep within her. She understood now that Hendrik wasn't the monster she had feared. He had once been like her, trying to outrun the inevitable, trying to escape the guilt that clung to his soul. But the ship had claimed him, just as it was claiming her now. He finally turned to face her, his expression weary. "This ship, it's a passage for those like us. The passengers you see, the ones you think are real, they're just echoes. Faded memories of what they once were." Alina swallowed hard, her mind spinning. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Hendrik's gaze softened. "We're here because we couldn't move on. Because we died with unfinished business, unresolved pain. The ship takes us, keeps us. And now, it's time for you to accept your place." Alina felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "You're meant to guide the others," Hendrik said quietly. "Just like I was meant to guide you." She stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. She had spent so long fighting, so long trying to deny what was happening to her. But now, standing on the deck with Hendrik, she realized the truth. It was time to stop running. The next morning, Alina returned to her cabin. The sun was rising outside, casting a soft glow over the horizon, but she no longer found comfort in the light. Her body felt different, lighter, as though she were no longer bound by the laws of the physical world. She stood in front of the mirror again, but this time, she wasn't afraid of what she saw. Her reflection was barely there, her form translucent, her feet hovering just above the floor. She reached out to touch the glass, but her hand passed through it effortlessly. The sensation was both terrifying and liberating. Her belongings, the clothes she had worn, the books she had brought with her, even her phone, felt foreign, like remnants of a life that no longer belonged to her. She was no longer Alina Morrow, the successful lawyer. She was something else now. Something tied to this ship, this eternal voyage. As the final moments of her transition occurred, Alina felt the energy of the ship flowing through her. It pulsed in her veins, in her mind, binding her to its dark, mechanical heart. She could hear the whispers more clearly now, could feel the presence of the others, souls like hers, drifting silently through the corridors. Her physical form vanished completely, leaving behind only the ghost of who she had once been. She was now part of the ship. Hours later, a new passenger entered cabin 432. She was young, her eyes weary from long hours of travel. She dropped her suitcase onto the bed and stood at the window, gazing out at the ocean. The gentle rocking of the ship, the soft sound of the waves, it all felt peaceful to her. As the sun began to set, the woman unpacked her things, a soft smile playing on her lips. This was the escape she had been longing for, the calmness she needed. She hadn't realized just how much she needed this time away. As the night fell, she slipped into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The silence was soothing, and she felt herself begin to drift into a deep, restful sleep. But then, there was a knock. Faint, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to wake her. She sat up, blinking in the darkness. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it. Then, the knock came again. She climbed out of bed, her heart beating a little faster, and opened the door to find nothing. The hallway was empty, silent. Confused, she turned back toward the bed. And there, standing in the corner, was Alina. Her hollow eyes fixed on the woman, and her lips parted as she whispered softly, "It's time."